This 1919 photo of two nurses looks hopeful until you see their pins. At first glance, the image seems like a quiet celebration. Two young women in crisp white uniforms stand outside a hospital entrance, shoulders squared, hands folded neatly at their waists. The sun catches the starch of their aprons. Their expression suggests pride, maybe even relief. It looks like the kind of photograph families frame and pass down for generations. But one detail would not let the archivist go. Dr. Corrine Ashby had spent 11 years cataloging medical ephemera for the Grady Memorial Hospital History Project in Atlanta. She had seen thousands of photographs from the early 20th century, graduating classes lined up on hospital steps, surgeons posed beside operating tables, nurses in identical uniforms holding diplomas like shields against a world that doubted their competence. Most of these images told simple stories: ambition, survival, entry into a profession that offered women a rare kind of independence. But this photograph, pulled from a water-damaged box in a church basement on Auburn Avenue, was different. Karen first noticed the uniforms. Both women wore the standard nursing dress of the era: long white skirts, starched bibs, close-fitting caps. Their postures mirrored each other. They could have been classmates. They could have been friends. But when Karen adjusted her magnifying lamp and leaned closer, she saw it. The pins on their left shoulders did not match. One woman wore a small enamel crest that Karen recognized immediately. It belonged to the Grady Hospital Training School for Nurses, a program that had operated continuously since the 1890s. The crest was distinctive, a shield shape with a caduceus and 3 letters intertwined. The other woman's pin was different, slightly larger, a different shape, more oval than shield. The design featured a lamp, not a caduceus, and beneath the lamp, barely visible in the photograph, were initials that Karen did not recognize. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written 2 names: R. Simmons and E. Pace. Below that, a date: June 1919. Karen set the photograph down and stared at it for a long moment. She knew from years of work in this archive that Grady Hospital had maintained strictly segregated nursing programs well into the 1960s. White students trained in one building, black students trained in another. They wore different uniforms. They received different diplomas. They were not photographed together. Yet here were 2 women standing side by side, wearing pins from 2 different schools. One pin she recognized, the other she had never seen before. This was not just a pretty old photo. Something here was wrong. Karen had come to archival work through an unusual path. She had trained as a nurse herself, completing her degree at Emory in the late 1990s, before discovering that her real passion lay not in clinical practice, but in the stories behind the practice. She wanted to know who had walked these halls before her, who had earned the right to wear the uniform, who had been denied that right, and why. Her office in the basement of the Grady Archives was cluttered with the debris of other people's lives: boxes of uncatalogued photographs, folders of graduation programs, ledgers listing students admitted and students expelled. She had learned to read these documents the way a detective reads a crime scene. Every smudge, every correction, every blank space told a story. Most photographs from this era were easy to place. Karen could identify the decade by the cut of a sleeve. She could guess the hospital by the architecture visible through a window. She had memorized the pins and crests of every major nursing school in Georgia, and most of the minor ones too. But this pin, the oval one with the lamp, did not appear in any of her reference materials. She removed the photograph from its sleeve and examined it under stronger light. The paper stock was consistent with 1919. The sepia tone had not been artificially aged. The clothing, the hairstyles, the background, everything placed the image firmly in the immediate post-war period. This was not a forgery or a misattributed date. She turned her attention to the back of the photograph again. The handwriting was small and precise: R. Simmons and E. Pace. June 1919. Below the names, in even fainter pencil, was a third line she had missed on first inspection. It read, McVicker, class of 1918. Karen sat back. McVicker. She knew that name. It had appeared in a handful of documents she had processed years earlier, always in passing, never explained. A nursing school, black nursing school, one that had operated somewhere in Atlanta during the 1910s, but she had never found any photographs, never found any alumni records, never found any pens. If this photograph was authentic, and if the pen on the second woman's shoulder really belonged to a school called McVicker, then Karen was looking at something that should not exist. A record of a place that the official history of Atlanta medicine had worked very hard to forget. She opened her laptop and began to search. The McVicker Training School for Colored Nurses had been founded in 1906 by a consortium of Black Baptist churches in Atlanta. It operated out of a converted house on Houston Street, less than a mile from Grady Hospital. For 12 years, it trained young black women in the fundamentals of nursing, anatomy, hygiene, wound care, obstetrics. Its graduates served black communities across Georgia and beyond, working in segregated wards, private homes, and rural clinics where no white nurse would go. Karen found these details scattered across old newspaper clippings, church bulletins, and a single academic article from 1987 that had received almost no citations. The school had never been large. It graduated perhaps 15 to 20 students per year, but it had been real. It had issued diplomas. It had awarded pens, and then, in late 1918, it had closed. The official reason, according to a brief notice in the Atlanta Independent, was financial strain caused by the influenza pandemic. The school had lost several faculty members to the disease. Donations had dried up. The building needed repairs that no one could afford. But Karen noticed something else in the timeline. In early 1919, just weeks after McVicker closed, Grady Hospital announced the creation of a new auxiliary training program for Negro nurses. The program promised accelerated certification. It promised clinical experience in Grady's segregated wards. It promised, in carefully worded language, integration into the broader medical mission of the hospital. The announcement had been covered enthusiastically by white newspapers. The Atlanta Constitution called it a progressive step in medical education. The Grady Board of Directors received commendations from city officials, but Karen could find no record of anyone who had actually graduated from this auxiliary program. No class photographs, no alumni lists, no pens. She returned to the photograph of our Simmons and E. Pace. One woman wore a Grady crest. The other wore a McVicker lamp. They stood together outside a hospital entrance in June 1919. 6 months after McVicker had closed, and several months into this mysterious auxiliary program. What were they doing together? What did their mismatched pens mean? Karen picked up the phone and called Dr. Lauren Whitfield, historian at Spelman College, who specialized in the history of black professional women in the South. "I think I found something," Karen said, "but I don't understand what I'm looking at." Dr. Whitfield arrived at the archive 2 days later. She was a tall woman in her 60s, with gray locks and reading glasses perpetually perched on her forehead. She had spent 3 decades researching the parallel institutions that black communities had built during Jim Crow, schools and churches and mutual aid, societies that white historians had largely ignored. She knew the landscape of forgotten places better than almost anyone. Karen handed her the photograph. Whitfield studied it for a long time without speaking. She turned it over. She read the penciled names. She held it up to the light. "McVicker," she said finally. "I've heard that name exactly twice in my career. Once in an oral history with a woman in Savannah who said her grandmother had trained there. Once in a footnote to a dissertation about black midwifery in Georgia. Both times, the trail went cold. What happened to it? That's what I've never been able to determine." Whitfield set the photograph down. The school existed. That much is clear. It trained nurses. It issued credentials. And then it vanished. Not just clothes vanished, as if someone had gone through the records and removed every trace. Why would anyone do that? Whitfield looked at her. That depends on what the school's closure made possible. She asked to see the materials Karen had gathered about the Grady Auxiliary Program. She read through the newspaper clippings, the board announcements, the carefully worded press releases. Her expression darkened. "This is a pattern," she said. "I've seen it before in other contexts. A black institution closes under financial pressure. A white institution immediately announces a new program that claims to serve the same population. The new program receives public praise for being progressive and charitable. But somehow, the people who were supposed to benefit never quite receive what they were promised." "You think the auxiliary program was a fraud?" "I think," Whitfield said slowly, "that we need to find out what actually happened to the McVicker students after their school closed. Where did they go? What credentials did they end up with? And why is one of them standing next to a Grady nurse in this photograph, still wearing her McVicker pin?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Karen had posted a cropped version of the photograph on a medical history forum, asking if anyone could identify the oval pin with the lamp. Most responses were unhelpful. But 3 weeks later, she received an email from a woman named Denise Pace Robinson in Chicago. The subject line read, "That's my great-grandmother." Denise was 74 years old. She had grown up hearing stories about her great-grandmother, Ethel Pace, who had trained as a nurse in Atlanta and later moved north to work in the black hospitals of Chicago. She had a small collection of documents that had been passed down through the family, a Bible, a few letters, and a single page from what appeared to be a hospital logbook. She scanned the logbook page and sent it to Karen. The page was dated March 1919. It listed the names of 12 women. Under the heading, Auxiliary Nursing Staff, Colored Ward. Beside each name was a notation. Some said McVicker 1917 or McVicker 1918. Others said Spellman or Maurice Brown or simply untrained. Beside each McVicker graduate's name, someone had added a second notation in red ink, "Credentials pending review." At the bottom of the page, in the same red ink, was a handwritten instruction. All auxiliary staff to wear Grady insignia during ward rotations. McVicker pins to be collected and held until status determination. Karen read the page 3 times. She understood now. The auxiliary program had not been a new training initiative. It had been a way to absorb the students and graduates of McVicker into Grady's workforce without paying them, without credentialing them, and without acknowledging where they had actually trained. The McVicker graduates had been told their credentials were pending review. They had been stripped of their pins. They had been put to work in the segregated wards, performing the same duties as fully certified nurses, but without the title, the pay, or the professional recognition. And meanwhile, Grady Hospital had claimed credit for running an integrated training program that brought black women into the medical profession. The McVicker nurses had not vanished. They had been stolen. Karen flew to Chicago to meet Denise in person. They sat in Denise's living room, surrounded by photographs of 4 generations of Pace women. Denise had her great-grandmother's Bible open on her lap. Inside the front cover, in careful handwriting, Ethel Pace had recorded the dates that mattered most to her: her baptism, her wedding, the births of her children, and one more entry, McVicker Training School, graduated with honors. May 1918. She never stopped calling herself a McVicker nurse, Denise said. Even after she left Atlanta, even after she got recredentialed in Illinois, she kept that pin hidden in a drawer her whole life. She said it was proof of what had been taken from her. Did she ever talk about what happened at Grady? Denise nodded slowly. She talked about it once near the end of her life. She said they made her work double shifts in the influenza wards. They told her it was part of her training, but there was no training, just work changing linens, feeding patients, holding hands while people died. She did that for 8 months, and at the end, they told her she still hadn't met the requirements for certification. They said she would need to complete another full year of training, starting from the beginning, if she wanted a Grady diploma. What did she do? She left. She got on a train to Chicago and never went back. She had to start over completely. She took the Illinois nursing examination in 1921 and passed on her first try. But those years in Atlanta, all that work, none of it counted. They erased her. Karen looked at the Bible, at the careful handwriting, at the pride that Ethel Pays had taken in recording her McVicker graduation decades before anyone would have cared. Why do you think she kept the pin hidden instead of wearing it? Denise was quiet for a moment. I asked her that once. She said, wearing it would have meant explaining it, and explaining it would have meant admitting what was done to her. She said, some things are easier to survive if you don't have to keep telling the story. Back in Atlanta, Karen presented her findings to the Grady Hospital History Committee. The meeting took place in a conference room on the 5th floor of the main administrative building. Around the table sat hospital administrators, communication staff, to members of the board of directors, and a lawyer whose presence no one explained. Dr. Whitfield had come as Karen's guest. Karen laid out the evidence, the photograph, the logbook page, the oral history from Denise Pays Robinson, the newspaper clippings that showed the timeline of McVicker's closure and the auxiliary program's launch, the reading notations ordering McVicker graduates to surrender their pens. She explained what she believed had happened. The auxiliary program had been a labor scheme disguised as education. Black nurses from a legitimate training school had been absorbed into Grady's workforce, stripped of their credentials, and used to staff the segregated wards during the deadliest pandemic in modern history. Their work had been erased. Their qualifications had been stolen. Kay and Grady had taken credit for a progressive initiative that had actually been an act of systematic professional theft. The room was silent when she finished. The hospital's communications director spoke first. This is a very serious allegation. It's not an allegation, Karen said. It's documentation. Documentation of events that happened over a century ago, the director replied. Events that no one currently at this institution had anything to do with. That's true, Karen said, but the institution's reputation was built partly on claims about that era. The auxiliary program is mentioned in the official history. It's cited in anniversary materials. It's part of how Grady presents itself as a leader in inclusive medical education. The board member to Karen's left shifted uncomfortably. What exactly are you proposing we do with this information? Acknowledge it, Karen said. Correct the record. Reach out to the descendants of the McVicker nurses. Some of them are still alive. Some of them have been trying to tell this story for decades. The least we can do is listen. The lawyer cleared his throat. There are liability considerations for events in 1919 for how we characterize those events publicly. If we frame this as institutional wrongdoing, we open ourselves to questions about other historical practices, about what else might be in the archives. Dr. Whitfield, who had been silent throughout the presentation, leaned forward. That's exactly right. There is more in the archives. There are always more stories like this one. The question is whether you want to be the institution that buries them or the institution that brings them to light. The communications director looked pained. We're not trying to bury anything. We're trying to be responsible about how we handle sensitive historical material. The material isn't sensitive because it's historical, Whitfield said. It's sensitive because it's true and because the descendants of the people who were harmed are still here. They still remember. They've been waiting for someone to believe them. The meeting ended without a decision. The committee agreed to take the matter under advisement and scheduled a follow-up session for the following month. Karen walked out of the building with Dr. Whitfield. They stood on the sidewalk in the late afternoon sun, looking up at the hospital's facade. What do you think they'll do? Karen asked. Whitfield shrugged. What institutions always do when confronted with their own history. They'll study it. They'll form a subcommittee. They'll commission a report. And eventually, if enough people keep pushing, they'll do the right thing, or at least a version of it. But it won't happen quickly, and it won't happen without pressure. So, what do we do in the meantime? Whitfield smiled. We write it down. We publish it. We make sure the story exists somewhere they can't control. And we find the other families. There were 12 names on that logbook page. Ethel Pace is only one of them. Over the next 18 months, Karen and Dr. Whitfield tracked down attendance of 8 of the 12 women listed in the March 1919 logbook. They found a retired teacher in Mobile whose grandmother, Ruby Simmons, had been the other woman in the original photograph. Ruby had also left Atlanta in the early 1920s. She had retrained in Alabama and spent 40 years working in rural clinics that served black sharecroppers. She had never received any recognition from Grady Hospital. She had never spoken publicly about what had happened there. They found a family in Detroit with a trove of letters written by a woman named Harriet Odom, who had described the auxiliary program in bitter detail. They call us students, but we are servants. She had written in 1919. They take our knowledge and give us nothing in return but exhaustion. They found church records in Savannah that listed 5 McVicker graduates as founding members of a mutual aid society for black nurses. The society had provided informal credentialing and job placement for women whose qualifications had been stolen or unrecognized. It had operated quietly for decades, a parallel system built to survive the failures of the official one. Each family had pieces of the story. Each family had been waiting, in their own way, for someone to ask. Dr. Whitfield compiled the oral histories into an academic article that was key, published in the Journal of African American History. Karen wrote a longer piece for a regional magazine. It's illustrated with the original photograph of R. Simmons and E. Pace. The story was picked up by several national outlets. It became, for a brief moment, a small piece of the larger reckoning that American institutions were undergoing about their racial histories. Grady Hospital eventually issued a statement. It acknowledged that the auxiliary program of 1919 had fallen short of its stated educational mission, and that the contributions of nurses trained at McVicker and other historically black institutions were not adequately recognized. The statement stopped short of calling what happened theft or exploitation. But it announced the creation of a scholarship fund for nursing students from underrepresented backgrounds, named in honor of the McVicker Training School. Denise Pace Robinson was invited to the announcement ceremony. She stood at a podium in the same hospital where her great-grandmother had worked without pay, without recognition, without even the right to wear her own pin. She held up the McVicker lamp that Ethel had kept hidden for 60 years. "This pin is proof," Denise said. "Proof that my great-grandmother was a nurse. Proof that she earned her credentials. Proof that what was done to her was wrong. For 100 years, this story lived only in our family. Now, it belongs to everyone." And now, finally, Ethel Pace is a McVicker nurse again. The photograph still hangs in the Grady Hospital archive, but the label beside it has changed. It used to read, "Two nurses outside Grady Hospital, circa 1919. Photographer, unknown." Now it reads, "Ethel Pace, McVicker Training School, Class of 1918, and Ruby Simmons McVicker, Training School, Class of 1917. Outside Grady Hospital, June 1919. Pace and Simmons were among dozens of black nurses whose credentials were suspended and whose labor was exploited under Grady's auxiliary training program. Both women later rebuilt their careers in other states." Photograph donated by the Pace Robinson family. The pins in the photograph are still mismatched. They always will be, but now anyone who looks closely will know why. One pin represents what was promised, the other represents what was taken, and the fact that both pins appear in the same photograph that someone thought to capture this moment. That the image survived 100 years in a church basement is itself a kind of evidence. Evidence that the women who were erased found ways to leave traces. Evidence that their descendants remembered. Evidence that the official story, no matter how carefully it was constructed, could never quite account for everything. Historians sometimes say that photography changed the nature of memory. Before the camera, forgetting was easy. The faces of the dead faded, the details of injustice blurred. But photographs persist. They hold still. They wait. And sometimes, if someone is paying attention, they reveal what was never meant to be seen. Karen still works in the Grady archive. She still processes boxes from church basements and estate sales. She still looks for the details that do not match. The pins that should not be there. The names that appear once and never again. She knows. Now that every photograph from this era carries a hidden question. Not just who were these people, but what were they not allowed to say? The camera accidentally captured that the photographer never intended to show. Two nurses outside Grady Hospital in 1919 were posing for a picture of hope. They were young, they were trained, they had survived a pandemic, they were standing in the sun. But look at their pens. Look at the mismatch. Look at what it means. One of them was being celebrated. The other was being erased. And now, at least, we know which was which.